His Excellency Professor Amos Sawyer, former President of the Republic of Liberia, His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambers, the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for West Africa and the Sahel, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the organizers of this event, where we are all gathered here today to celebrate a friend, a comrade, a source of inspiration, a key to all of us. We've gathered here today to have this event, public event, under the theme, Celebrating a Life of Academic Excellence, Public Service, Thought Leadership, and Activism. All of you have copies of the program, so you can have a sense of how the day today and also tomorrow will unfold. My name is Yao Graham. I'm the coordinator of Third World Network Africa, one of the institutions organizing this event. The idea of celebrating Aki's public life and contributions started sometime last year and went through various conceptions before we settled on this format. I would like to pay tribute to the original group of people who initiated this idea. Our chairperson, who I'll properly introduce today, later, Professor Tichwa Menu, Professor Horace Campbell, and Dr. Willie Mutunga, former Chief Justice of Kenya, and also Professor Issa Shivji of Tanzania. Both Willie Mutunga and Issa knew Aki as students when he was teaching in Dar es Salaam. And Horace also knew him from East Africa. And Willie was here not too long ago to give a lecture. And when Horace was then the chair, the occupant of the Nkrumah Chair of African Studies at the University of Ghana. And of course, Tichwa is an old student of the Akis also, like myself. And so they felt that it was right that somebody who's been so inspirational, so influential, rather than wait and write exaggerated tributes when he dies, it is better to actually, as they say, ground with him whilst he's still alive and join in celebrating his contributions. So I'm really glad that we have been able to come this far and to finally launch today the 2 days of public lectures, photo exhibition, which is around you. Unfortunately, because of the wind outside, the exhibition has had to be brought in. But when there is a pause, maybe at the end of the event, all of you please go and see. It's not quite, detailed, but it's sufficiently representative of, some of the passages of Aki's life, and take some images from there. But before I introduce the chair, I would like to acknowledge the contributions of various individuals and institutions which have made this event possible. In addition to my own organization, Third World Network Africa, I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Akunu Dake and his organization, Heritage Development. Akunu really has been the primary organizer in terms of bringing his experience as an event organizer, selflessly, as an old comrade of Aki's, to make this event possible. Star Ghana Foundation, whose board Aki chairs, also is one of the supporters of this event. And then the Ghana Oil and Gas Inclusive Growth also is one of the institutions which has supported this initiative. The Volta River Authority, another institution whose board Aki has chaired in the past. Mr. Lariado, a good friend of Aki's, has also supported this event. There's also Mr. Benji Kent, who made a film for us. Amarkine, Amatefio, who put together the exhibition. There's also the Institute for Democratic Development, IDEG, has also been an important contributor. And then the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, CODESRIA, has also supported this event. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, Dr. Godwin Murunga, who came all the way from Dakar to join us in this celebration. The Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana has also supported this event. The Ghana Dance Ensemble welcomed Aki in true Ghana, gourmet style and brought him, to the front. And of course, our host institution, the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, who generously provided this venue as their contribution to the organization of the event. Professor Shivji, who currently is the director of the Nyerere Resource Center, and Professor Horace Campbell, who teaches at Syracuse University in New York, as I said earlier, were part of those who initiated this exercise, but they are not here with us. But they sent short messages, which I'd like to read to you before I introduce the chair for the event. Issa said, "I came to know Aki as a young student when he was a young lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam. I cannot say we struck a chord then, as we found ourselves on different sides of the ideological fence. As years passed, we matured, our ideas matured, and our relationship deepened as we carried forward progressive social and Pan-Africanist ideas forged in the crucible of struggle on our two respective campuses, the University of Ghana, Legon in Accra, and the University of Dar es Salaam at the Hill. May the bonds of comradeship outlive us both." Horace, on his part, says, "This is a short note of solidarity from the heart of Babylon. Aki has been a steady force in the long struggles for dignity and self-determination. I'm sorry that I cannot be there in the flesh, but I'm there in the spirit, and I'm positive that the gathering and reasonings will bring its own energy to inspire a new generation to carry forward the work of struggles for Africa's redemption. A luta continua, Horace." Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our chairperson for today, Professor Teichua Menu, who is Emerita Professor of African Studies at the University of Ghana. She served as director at the Social Development Policy Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Ethiopia from 2014 to 2017. Before that, she had been Professor of African Studies at the University of Ghana, where she also served as the Director of the Institute of African Studies between 2002 and 2009. She holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in law from the University of Ghana, Legon, and the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and a PhD in anthropology from Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana, USA. Her research interests are in African development, women's rights and empowerment issues, contemporary African migrations, and African higher education systems, and she has published widely in those areas. She has practiced as a lawyer and is active in the women's movement in Ghana and Africa, and serves on the boards of several international, continental, and national organizations. Currently, she's vice chair of the National Development Planning Commission and a member of the advisory board of the Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation. She's a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received several awards and recognitions, including the University of Ghana's Meritorious Service Award for 2007, Ghana's Order of the Volta officer class in 2008 and an honorary doctorate degree from the University of Sussex, UK in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, your chair, Emerita Professor Techiu Amen.
Good evening, everybody. The celebrant, Professor Aki Lakpa-Sawyer, Judith, and the rest of the family, distinguished guests, members of the Planning and Production Committee of the Aki at 80 celebrations, all of whom are not present with us this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I join Yao in welcoming you all to this celebration, and I'm honored to chair today's event. Distinguished guests, allow me to make my own personal tribute to Aki that I have titled A Prof of One's Own, after Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Last week, I delivered a public lecture, and during the interactive session, a young woman who had some questions of her own concluded by asking me to be her mentor, and she has subsequently written to me. But unlike her, I did not have to ask to be mentored. Indeed, I do not believe that I knew that term in the early 1970s when I made Aki's acquaintance. I had just turned 19 and entered the Faculty of Law at the University of Ghana. My first year was particularly challenging, not academically, but in terms of my notions around social justice and what I expected to find at the Faculty of Law. After some attempts to change courses and receiving stern rebukes from my father, as well as senior students at the faculty who felt I was presumptuous and should consider myself privileged to be admitted into the faculty, I did settle in, even as my passion dimmed somewhat. In particular, I found the legal treatment of women and their rights then quite galling, added to a lecturer helpfully telling me that I was there to learn the rules and not deal with notions. But I survived my undergraduate years through deep immersion in student and Pan-African activism, and Aki was very much part of that story. Thank you, Prof, for constantly reminding us that going to university is about more than obtaining a job at the end of your studies. With the support of a research grant that Aki had obtained, and I'm not sure he remembers this, I joined a group of mostly male students to research production relations in the Ghanaian countryside one long vacation. And I remember vividly that long vacation, more than 40 years ago, spent trekking through declining cocoa growing areas in parts of northern Asante, now renamed Ahafo region. After my LLB program, the courses I took in the legal aspects of international trade and investments, among others, reignited my interest in the possibilities of using the law to advance broader political and societal issues. The encouragement I received from Professors Sawyer and Bochwe to pursue graduate studies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, was to be transformational for my career and personal development. Aki was also my sponsor when I was called to the bar in 1977 during a private ceremony in the Chief Justice's chamber. And I was actually looking for the photo of the two of us in our legal robes to bring, but I couldn't find it. Anyway, the CJ was civil and almost cordial. Later, another colleague who had been late to the ceremony informed us that when he arrived at the CJ's office, the CJ informed him that a bunch of radicals had just left his office. To which he replied that he was supposed to have been one of them. I want to thank Aki and Judith for their friendship and guidance over the years. I stayed in their house on several occasions, ate innumerable lunches and dinners as a student and later as a lecturer, and was a frequent visitor to the VC's lodge when they lived there. Through them, I got to know Aki's children, mother, and wider family. Through the years, ladies and gentlemen, Aki has been there for many of us as an inspiration, counselor, numwe, friend. Our years together as members of CODESRIA in the UNESCO Working Group for Higher Education in Africa, my service on AAU committees, and more latterly in the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, and our shared interest in African liberation, development and transformation, and in African higher education has deepened that association. I have truly had my own prof in my corner. He has encouraged and pushed me with his customary rigor, but also stayed interested in my general progress and well-being. Never have I felt or been made to feel that I was dealing with my senior in all areas of life. May we all imbibe that spirit of a life dedicated to scholarship, deep thought, simplicity, commitment, activism, and public service. Professor Sawyer, Aki, Numwe, Ayiko, Oyuadon. So having whetted your appetite, I now turn to read a biography of Professor Akilapa Sawyer. Oh, biography sounds too much. Okay, profile. Professor Akilapa Sawyer, Aki to many, turned 80 in March 2019. Aki's life has been a demonstration of high commitment to the ideals of social and economic justice, African independence and transformation, rigorous standards of scholarship, as well as to high standards in public life and leadership. Akilapa Sawyer grew up in the then Gold Coast during the militant struggles for self-determination. Aki's father, who died when he was only 9 years old, made important contributions to these struggles. The Honorable Akilapa Sawyer, Sr., an Accra lawyer, was one of the leading public and political figures of his generation. He was, among other things, a founder member of the National Congress of British West Africa, a member of the Colonial Legislative Council, and a patron of sports and many public causes. Aki's mother, Charlotte Amy Sawyer, named Metal, as a single parent, was the key figure in Aki's upbringing, including overseeing schoolwork and making the considerable material sacrifices that enabled Aki to fulfill his dream of studying law. Her incredible longevity, she died aged 103, enabled her to see the fullness of what her parenting and sacrifices had facilitated. After completing his secondary school education at Achimota School, Aki studied law at universities in the United Kingdom and the United States, obtaining his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley. Aki's teaching and research was initially mainly in law. Over the years, however, as he moved across academic positions in Tanzania through Ghana to Papua New Guinea, with involvements at other universities around the world, his work increasingly reflected a multidisciplinary approach. This shift was rooted in his evolving theoretical and political perspectives and a growing concern with the challenges of underdevelopment and transformation in Africa. Aki's growing disciplinary scope and interest allied with the transcending of the parameters of mainstream jurisprudence and informed his involvement in the community of progressive scholars in Africa and beyond. This was exemplified in his active involvement in CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, in which he became a leading influence and served as president of the governing council. Aki's first academic job was in the Faculty of Law at the then University of East Africa, Dar es Salaam. This context made an important contribution to his development as a progressive scholar and activist, with a consistently anti-imperialist position. Ladies and gentlemen, we must remember that newly independent Tanzania was in the vanguard of the anti-colonial struggle, including serving as the headquarters of the then OAU Liberation Committee, which oversaw collective African support for the national liberation movements across Africa. The University of Dar es Salaam was at the forefront of the struggle for intellectual freedom in Africa, and its progressive anti-imperialist scholarship became known as the Dar es Salaam School. Aki's contemporaries in Dar included well-known radicals such as Thomas Shentes, Justinian Reyemamu, Henry Mapolo, John Saw, Lionel Cliff, and Walter Rodney. Specifically in the Faculty of Law, his contemporaries included Saw Pichotto, Yashkai, Joe Kaniwani, and Harub Othman. In this environment, he contributed to shaping a generation of progressive lawyers from all parts of the world, including Professor Issa Shivji and Willy Mutunga, later Chief Justice of Kenya. Aki was a professor of law at the University of New Guinea for almost a decade, an appointment he took up after many years in the law faculty at the University of Ghana in Legon. In Legon, just as in Dar es Salaam, Aki was a central figure in an influential circle of progressive law lecturers and their associates in other faculties who questioned establishment values and mainstream scholarship and encouraged their students to explore beyond their boundaries. They were an important influence in the development of a progressive leftist tradition in the Ghanaian student movement of that period, and his contemporaries and associates included the late Jawa Pronti, Professor Kwesi Bochwe, Professor Ebo Hachfo, Professor Ama Ateidu, and Professor Atabrichum. Aki returned to Legon as Vice-Chancellor after his years in Papua New Guinea. This was the beginning of his transition from the classroom into an administrative, research, and policy engagement with the challenges of tertiary education in Africa. That shift was completed when, on leaving Legon, he joined the staff of the Association of African Universities, AAU, and subsequently became its Secretary General. Ladies and gentlemen, Aki's years of leadership of the University of Ghana was in the context of the dominance of neoliberal structural adjustment programs, SAPs, across Africa, for which Ghana was the poster child. One of the more depressing and destructive features of SAPs was the questioning of the value of tertiary education in Africa, and therefore the wisdom of allocating public expenditures to it. The defense of tertiary education and its value in Africa's transformation agenda became and has remained an important element of Aki's intellectual and activist opposition to neoliberalism. Aki's leadership of the Association of African Universities embodied this agenda and was an important and dynamic period in the life of that organization. Distinguished guests, the advancement of the African transformation agenda has been also an important driver of Aki's many public service roles in Ghana, across Africa, and internationally. These public service roles have been in education, development policy, political governance, etc. In Ghana, several of these have related to the energy and mineral sectors and the strengthening of citizens' organizations and expression. In recent years, Aki, through his role on the boards of several advocacy NGOs and as chair of funding institutions, has played an important role in the deepening of Ghana's democratic culture. Ladies and gentlemen, accepting to chair the National Negotiation Committee for the VALCO Agreement between 1982 and 1990 was a major political gamble, as well as an opportunity to lead the reform of an agreement Aki had campaigned against as a major symbol of the overbearing influence of foreign capital in Ghana. The VALCO renegotiations redressed inequities that the Nkrumah government accepted so as to access funding for the construction of the Akosombo Dam. The dam, as we remember, was the centerpiece of the Volta River project a cornerstone of Nkrumah's industrialization and transformation agenda. The subsequent utilization and sharing of the experience from the VALCO negotiations has been one of Aki's most important contributions to development policy and practice. Ladies and gentlemen, a similar opportunity to combine political commitment and public service was afforded by Aki's appointment to chair the National Committee appointed by Ghana's then president to plan and oversee the celebration of the centenary of the birth of Kwame Nkrumah. The work of the committee made an important contribution to the rehabilitation of Nkrumah's contested place in Ghanaian history. Aki's leadership of the Nkrumah centenary celebration neatly united his public service and his status as one of the intellectual leaders of the Ghanaian left and one of Africa's most respected progressive scholars. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this status is the product of his many years of work in the academy, in public policy analysis, in building independent intellectual institutions and spaces in Africa and the global South, as a mentor and teacher to young scholars and activists, and as comrade in fighting causes for social justice, the self-determination of peoples, the accountability of political power against the power of transnational corporations, imperialism, and big power bullying. Over the years, Aki has been remarkable for his ability to bridge generational divides and earn the respect of even those who do not share his values and principles. So this is the man we're celebrating tonight as we examine his academic excellence, public service, thought leadership, and activism. So we have representatives from some of these many organizations that Aki has been associated with over the years, and I'd like to invite them to get ready to come up to deliver their statements, starting with the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, followed by the University of Ghana, the School of Law, the University of Ghana, the Association of African Universities, the Volta River Authority, and last but not the least, CODESRIA. There will be other statements tomorrow, but these are the statements today. So, Professor Anyido, Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, please come up.
Distinguished scholar and elder statesman, Aki Lakpa Sawyer, you were elected and inducted into the Fellowship of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1992. Your reputation as a public intellectual preceded your arrival. Since then, the work of the Academy has been enhanced by the special gifts and skills you have accumulated and cultivated from your many years of dedicated service to a wide range of national and international organizations. In all these engagements, you draw on your fine training in the complexities of law and the broad-based humanistic education to bring sensible solutions to challenging problems. For instance, as chief negotiator for the government of Ghana in the Ghana VALCO negotiations, you led a team of brilliant, public-spirited young intellectuals to save Ghana from further injury to her economic fortunes as a result of what was often cited as one of the most unfair industrial agreements between the global North and the global South. Debates within the Academy have been greatly enhanced by your incisive intervention. 4 major lectures delivered by you stand out for special consideration, for the boldness of the vision that informs them and the intellectual force and clarity of their basic arguments. In your 2015 inaugural presidential address titled, Thinking Our Way to Social Fulfillment, the Place of a Learned Society, you begin with a general comment on knowledge, its sources and location, and you make us sit up by locating family, the home, the community, and its traditions as the foundational and enduring sources of awareness. This is contrary to common assumptions that formal institutions of learning constitute foundations of knowledge. Your 2016 presidential address titled Marching Forward to the Past reports briefly on the vigorous exercise to rethink and revision the academy, its ways of work, and its relations with its stakeholders and society generally. The strengthening of the academy to undertake and to manage research projects, the development of structured relations with relevant public agencies and other stakeholder bodies, and the initiation of a national dialogue series to provide platforms for informed discussion of critical national and global issues. And in your 1995 inaugural lecture titled, Does Africa Really Need Her Universities?, you reminded us of the benefits of the significant investments made in university education during the years of independence. We can count other major contributions on the platform on the academy. In these lectures and in your many other contributions to public discourse, one thing is clear: your total dedication to a productive interconnection between intellectual endeavor and the welfare of society at large. You always speak truth clearly, firmly, with little flourish and fanfare. Often, we have to strain our ears to hear you, reminding us that public discourse need not be conducted with so much screaming as is the practice these days. Your passion to be an attorney for truth is remarkable, and you do so with admirable care, especially in dealing with truth that hurts, truth that carries a sense of anxiety and even shame. In your Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Lecture, you did not hesitate to remind fellows of the Academy of a sore point in our history, the fact that in helping the Academy to mark the memory of its founder, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, we were helping to right a wrong that was committed by the Academy 40 years earlier when Nkrumah was dismissed from the fellowship of the Academy. Professor Sawyer, your insistence on raising a point of order when everyone is anxious to rush the discussion to an illogical conclusion is something we always admire. Council and fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences are proud of your countless distinguished accomplishments. We understand that long life is a special blessing in your family. Now that you are 80 years young, may you live even longer, and of course, with good health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Anyidoho, for rendering this heartfelt tribute from the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. We also have a tribute from the University of Ghana on behalf of the Vice Chancellor and the Center representative. May I invite him to come up to read the statement from the University of Ghana.
Madam Chairperson, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Emmanuel Bedu, College Secretary of the College of Basic and Applied Sciences, University of Ghana. I'm here to represent the Vice Chancellor, Professor Ebenezer Oduro-Owusu, who would have wished to be here, but other equally important engagements came up at the very last minute. He has therefore delegated me to represent him here. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor, the university management, and the entire university community, I wish to extend our warm felicitations on this momentous occasion of the Oak birthday anniversary of our venerable professor and erudite scholar, Professor Akila Pasoya. Professor Akila Pasoya, as you all very well know, was the university's fourth executive head, serving as Vice Chancellor from 1985 to 1992. He joined the University of Ghana as a lecturer in the Faculty of Law in 1970 and rose through the ranks to become a full professor of law. After leaving the services of the university, Professor Akila Pasoya pursued his agenda of academic freedom, giving it a greater voice on the continent within the circles of the Association of African Universities as Secretary General. He was a former president of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences and also served as a member of the Council of State. He also served as the chief negotiator for the government of Ghana in the renegotiation of the Volta Aluminium Company VALCO agreement. Beside his leadership capacity, one contribution of Professor Sawyer that stands out is the time and energy he devoted towards the preservation of academic freedom at the University of Ghana. Even in retirement, Professor Akisoya continues to be an active member of the university community, participating in both formal and informal events of the university. He will always sleep in quietly and sit far away from being recognized. Professor Akisoya was gracious to accept to be a member of the visitation panel in 2007, a panel that made far-reaching recommendations to enforce the integrity of examinations and also provided invaluable input to university governance and administration. Recently, in 2017, when the decision was taken to review the collegiate system of governance at the university, the lot fell on him to chair the review panel. Professor Sawyer could be trusted to readily accept assignments entrusted to him by the university, and for this selfless contribution, we owe him a debt of gratitude. The university in 2002 conferred upon him the degree of laws, honoris causa, as an attestation to the significant role he has played, not only as a vice-chancellor, but a crucial advocate of developments at the university. Yet again, in April 2016, the Akila Pasoya Street, named after him, was unveiled in recognition of his contribution. In view of his invaluable services to Mother Ghana, he was conferred with the highest national honor of Companion of the Order of the Volta. On a lighter note, it appears few people in the University of Ghana and perhaps outside of the university may know that Professor Akisoya has another first name, or rather used to. That name is George. I guess this is news to many of you gathered here, and it was to me as well until a few days ago. Perhaps it would be good to send a formal notification to Wikipedia that George is no longer in use. We at the University of Ghana do not see ourselves breaking the bond between us and Professor Akisoya anytime soon, and will continue to draw inspiration and strength from him. Our birthday wish to you is that you live to see many more years and continue to live your life surrounded by your family and friends. Once again, the University of Ghana wishes you a happy birthday, and may you enjoy this wonderful milestone with the ones who love and appreciate you dearly. Thank you.
Please convey our appreciation to the Vice Chancellor and do inform him that actually the names are George Frederick Arthur. So now, I'd like to call the Dean of the School of Law, University of Ghana, Professor Raymond Atuguba.
Good evening, and all protocols observed. A statement from the University of Ghana School of Law at an event marking the public life and contribution of Professor Akila Kasoya. Professor Akila Kasoya was a member of the Faculty of Law, as it was then called, of the University of Ghana from 1970 to 1981. During the period, he demonstrated an excellent command of the subject matter of his courses, sterling teaching abilities, quality debating skills, and a genuine interest in his students, equipping them with knowledge, skills, and values that inured to the benefit of Ghana and beyond. Professor Akila Kasoya was one of the most important intellectual influences, not only in law, but in related social sciences as well. He nurtured scholarly debates on development issues, contributing especially to the International Investment Law Program, which sought to examine political economy and development from various perspectives. Through insights generated by him, Professor Akila Kasoya successfully situated the role of law in the context of other social sciences, adding to the innovative way of handling legal education from a multidisciplinary perspective. Professor Sawyer has continued to maintain an interest in the School of Law, placing his wealth of experience at our disposal. He has never failed to share his candid and profound thoughts with the School of Law. In addition to his love for legal scholarship, Professor Sawyer has always been a radical thinker with an abiding passion for political economy. Indeed, because of the efforts of Professor Sawyer and his associates in the 1970s, some considered the law faculty a rival to the political science department at Legon as a center for the analysis of issues relating to political economy. During his lectures in those days, Professor Sawyer engaged the students in active debates over legal concepts, which contributed to nurturing critical thinking abilities and a better appreciation of the role of law in the broader social context. He did not only teach his students to become astute lawyers, but also to be conscious of the values that culminate in the welfare of the ordinary person. His last job before joining the Faculty of Law at Legon was at the Faculty of Law in Dar es Salaam in the Tanzania of Julius Nyerere, from where he cultivated and transported the need to inculcate a social awareness in law students. To the recollections of a former colleague, the greatest academic contribution that Professor Sawyer made was the development of young and inquisitive minds to challenge them to a multiplicity of avenues for solving societal problems through the application of law. This perspective was an invaluable addition to the blend of elements that constituted the intellectual climate at the law faculty at Legon. Another colleague recalls that Professor Sawyer taught contracts and conflict of laws, and together with Dr. Kwesi Bochwe, introduced the law of international trade and investment into the faculty's curriculum. Professor Sawyer contributed immensely to the faculty's lively intellectual atmosphere, with differences in outlook about the law and social issues vigorously articulated, sometimes polemically, but also respectfully. While proclaiming his preference for a socialist approach to the law, Aki was nevertheless sufficiently open-minded to allow his colleagues who did not share his philosophy of the law to make presentations to his students. That open-mindedness and the strength of his convictions stood him out as a teacher of quality. His numerous students who have achieved distinctions in their legal careers attest to this quality. He was a team player and had a way of yielding to the majority even when his position appeared unassailable. Once, he argued in the Faculty of Law for the Balm Library to be open on Sundays so that students could have more time to study and research there. Those who thought that Sunday was a day of rest and that it was anathema to work on such a day voiced their opposition. In bewilderment, he looked on silently and allowed the majority to carry the day. Time has vindicated his wisdom, as Balm Library is now ordinarily open to students on Sundays. To conclude, the best summation of Professor Sawyer's humanness, generosity, and love for his work and for his students is evident when yet another of his colleagues recounts that one of the recurring images of Professor Sawyer was seeing him after lectures walking with students in continuing conversations from the old faculty buildings up to the runabout at what used to be the main university gate by the Institute of Adult Education. We at the University of Ghana School of Law salute you and wish you the very best on your 80th birthday. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dean Atuguba, for this well-researched statement. The Association of African Universities, is there someone here to read their statement? There is a statement. We will defer it to tomorrow. Now, I'd like to call on a representative of the Volta River Authority to read their statement. No? Okay, so, Dr. Murunga, this is the time for Codestria's statement.
Professor Akilapa Sawyer and your family, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Godwin Murunga, the Executive Secretary of Codesria. I would like to begin with a caveat that my statement will not be like the others, partly because in the scheme of things, Professor Akilapa Sawyer taught the people who ended up teaching those ones who taught me. So that makes it very complicated for me. And when I came here, I made the assumption that I will be speaking exclusively on behalf of Codesria. But just a few years before I was born, Professor Akilapa Sawyer was in East Africa I am Kenyan, and I think he knows a few secrets about Kenya's inadequacies in relation to progressive politics. And I might end up having to apologize for the mistakes of my seniors. When I heard the news that we were thinking about this celebration, I started imagining a memoir that I'll read in 2021. I thought about the title and discovered how inadequate I was positioned to actually give that memoir a title. But it's a memoir that will be written by Professor Akilapa Soya. In that memoir, CODESRIA will have a chapter. And it will be a chapter with serious, rigorous, engaging scholarship on the social sciences and the humanities in Africa and indeed in the world. But also, it will be a chapter with some drama. Because Professor Akilapa Soya was the president of CODESRIA from 1996 to 1998. Now, in this room, there are people, I can easily count up to 10 people, who can speak to what the CODESRIA General Assembly normally is. A meeting of at least 500 social scientists, scholars, and humanities scholars from across the continent and the diaspora. But the 1995 General Assembly was particularly dramatic, partly because a number of young academics, and one of them is sitting here laughing, our keynote speaker, decided that it was a nice moment to shake up the council, right? And begin, quote unquote, to challenge the gerontocracies. And as they were doing that, there was also internally a gendered stroke feminist, if you will, disappointment with how masculine and patriarchal CODESRIA had cast itself. And so two movements meet at the 1995 General Assembly, at the end of which Professor Akilapa Soya was elected president of CODESRIA. And if he thought that the drama would end with the election, it was also a moment of transition in CODESRIA. From an executive secretary, Professor Thandika Mkandawire, who had served in the council from the 1970s, if I'm not wrong, risen through the ranks to become executive secretary and served his term, and we now needed a new executive secretary. And it was the duty of Professor Akilapa Soya as president of CODESRIA to see how to ensure that transition happens. And it seems to me that it was a moment of an early midlife crisis for the organization. And anybody who has handled adolescent and midlife crisis combining itself in between, you know how difficult it is for you to actually manage. And Professor Akilapa Soya did that. So those of us in CODESRIA, those of us in the African social science and humanities community, want to thank Ghana for the gift that Professor Akilapa Soya has been. And I won't dilute that by mentioning that a part of that training comes from East Africa. And I think the richness of this experience is informed for me partly by the vastness of Professor Akilapa Soya's understanding of the terrain, not just of the social sciences in Africa, but the social sciences and humanities generally, both within the continent and in the diaspora. And we thank you very much for this. Last year in December, CODESRIA held its 15th General Assembly. I had been appointed executive secretary, had not done, I think I was just doing my 1 year and a half, and I had this major event to organize. I had never done it before. And so in the secretariat, we spent close to 3 weeks, sleepless nights, worrying about making sure that the General Assembly is successful. And on the first day of that General Assembly, there was a panel, there was a keynote speaker, and Professor Akila Pasoya was the chair of the panel. And Prof, you didn't know this, but the few words you said just before you opened up the panel calmed all of us in the secretariat. You said you were happy to be invited to a CODESRIA General Assembly as a member of an older generation of CODESRIA, to an assembly that was being organized by a much younger generation of academics on the continent, and everything was going very well. That statement alone calmed all of us, and we had an interesting General Assembly. The integrity you bring to your work, the soft voice that articulates a firm message, the friendship you have with the big and the small is something that, speaking for myself, I have appreciated a lot. This is the river. We decided that we want to advertise ourselves in your house. And so, members of the Secretariat in CODESRIA, we came up with this nice little gift. We didn't know all the names. With the permission of the chair, if you will, we can go back and I have requested that the organizers allow me to make this presentation to you. I think that we can propose somebody to. Okay, we would like to present this to you. Thank you very much for the gift you have been to all of us.
Let's grab it from the top. So I do not get up quickly to seize the stage. We will not leave. But thank you very much for all those who were able to make your statements today. There will be an opportunity for the other statements to be made tomorrow. Now, we are coming to one of the highlights of this celebration, and this is the keynote address on the topic of democratization, active citizenship, and Africa's transformation. As you can see, all these are topics that are very dear to the life and work of Professor Akila Pasoya. And to deliver the keynote address is Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, Regional Director for Africa and West Africa, International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance for International Engagement. I want to present a brief profile of Professor Olukoshi. Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, as I've said, serves at the International IDEA as Regional Director for Africa and West Asia, not West Africa. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Leeds and a bachelor's degree from Ahmadu Bello University, and has more than 35 years experience in the areas of international relations, governance and human rights, both in the academic sector and in intergovernmental institutions. Bayo, as we call him, was a member of the African Union Assessment Panel and chair of the board of several think tanks, including the European Center for Development Policy Management and the West African Civil Society Institute. He also previously served as director of the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, IDEP, as executive director of the African Governance Institute, as executive secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRA, as director of research at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, senior research fellow, research program coordinator of the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, and senior program staff at the South Center in Geneva. Professor Olukoshi has published extensively on the politics of economic relations, governance and development, as well as on African higher education and development. His work on structural adjustment and the crisis of governance is among his most impactful. And among some of his publications are Africa and the Development Challenges in the New Millennium, the NEPAD Debate, 2006, co-edited with Jimmy Adishina and Jan Graham, The Elusive Prince of Denmark, Structural Adjustment and the Crisis of Governance in Africa, 1998, Between Liberalization and Oppression, The Politics of Structural Adjustment in Africa, 1995, co-edited with Tandika Kabiri, and Africa, Reaffirming a Commitment, 2010, co-edited with Jean-Bernard Ouedraogo and Ibri Mansala. Deliver the keynote address is Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, Regional Director for Africa and West Africa, International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or International IDEA. And I want to present a brief profile of Professor Olukoshi. Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, as I've said, serves at the International IDEA as Regional Director for Africa and West Asia, not West Africa. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Leeds and a bachelor's degree from Ahmadu Bello University, and has more than 35 years experience in the areas of international relations, governance and human rights, both in the academic sector and in intergovernmental institutions. Bayo, as we call him, was a member of the African Union Assessment Panel and chair of the board of several think tanks, including the European Center for Development Policy Management and the West African Civil Society Institute. He also previously served as director of the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, IDEP, as executive director of the African Governance Institute, as executive secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRA, as director of research at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, senior research fellow, research program coordinator of the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, and senior program staff at the South Center in Geneva. Professor Olukoshi has published extensively on the politics of economic relations, governance and development, as well as on African higher education and development. His work on structural adjustment and the crisis of governance is among his most impactful. And among some of his publications are Africa and the Development Challenges in the New Millennium, the NEPAD Debate, 2006, co-edited with Jimmy Adishina and Jan Graham, The Elusive Prince of Denmark, Structural Adjustment and the Crisis of Governance in Africa, 1998, Between Liberalization and Oppression, The Politics of Structural Adjustment in Africa, 1995, co-edited with Tandika Nkamdawiri, and Africa, Reaffirming Our Commitment, 2010, co-edited with Jean-Bernard Ouedraogo and Ebri Marcel. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, your keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor Techewa Menu, our distinguished and esteemed Professor George Frederick Arthur Akilakwasoya. I have to exact my pound of flesh from the outset. Excellency President Soya, Amos Soya, Excellency Dr. Chambers, I stand on all of the existing protocol. As we came in here with the Executive Secretary of CODESRI and looked through the photo exhibition, I tend to eat my voice, but as I get excited, as we looked at the photo exhibition, I said to Dr. Murunga that there's still yet some hope for him, in the sense that seeing the evolution over time of Professor Soya and how he has maintained handsomeness, even in old age, there is hope for you, Godwin. Much has already been said, Prof, and I'm not going to spend the rest of what we have for the evening repeating all which I agree with you have represented for many of us. The story of 1995, Novotel Dakar, should be written one day, and I hope that story will constitute an important part not only of your own personal life as an institution builder, but also of a critical moment in Africa's premier social science institution, when we needed to think seriously about issues of transition and the kind of person who ought to lead a major transition in the history of the Council. And that theme of institution building has, I think, been a recurrent one, as we've heard this evening, in your entire life story to date. I would argue that for me personally, what has stood out repeatedly, and which also has been broached upon by some of the speakers this evening, is the fact that your presentation, your appearance embodies almost instinctively a basic human decency, simplicity, dignity, and courage, which is not a common combination to find. And it is a combination which can be inspiring, and I think many of us here have tried to draw inspiration from that combination, but which can also be intimidating, particularly for those who know that they do wrong, particularly when they are entrusted with public office and the welfare of a commonwealth such as our country's. Transitions have also been a recurrent part of our story on the continent. I think in the context of the subject which concerns us today, the transitions which we have gone through to a new phase of an effort to democratize the continent is an important one in which you have also, in your personal and professional lives, played an important part. Let's cast our minds back to the 1990s, or late 1980s, when beginning from the very tiny next-door neighbor, Benin Republic, and people taking to the streets in what people assumed initially would be another one of the flash demonstrations, protesting difficult living conditions but which would eventually pass. I imagine that the regime of Matthew Kerekou actually would have calculated that it's okay, they will march for 1 weekend or 2, and it will be over. It, however, remained similar in a certain sense to what we have seen happening in Algiers and Khartoum, in which people actually doggedly stayed on the streets of Cotonou and other towns of Benin Republic, demanding that the time had come for change. And that experience was to be reproduced in several Francophone African countries, at a time when, in fact, I think many people did not give any chance to the fighting and ordinary people of our continent to be the drivers of change. Because after all, from the mid-1960s, we began to experience a process not only of the concentration and centralization of power, but also of its personalization in leaders who proclaimed themselves, if not as saviors, as life presidents. Life presidents who, in the period immediately following after independence, argued that two things which were dear to all of us, nation building and development, could only be achieved if the plural system of governance on the basis of which independence was achieved would be dismantled in favor of single-party rule. Interesting that you were in Dar es Salaam, and perhaps one of the most articulate exponents of the case for a uniting of energies across the continent. And I would argue that perhaps one of the most honest in terms of his intention with regard to that argument for a uniting of energies of the peoples of the newly independent countries of Africa for the attainment of unity and the acceleration of development was the late Julius Nyerere, who was the founding president of the Republic of Tanzania. But not many others were terribly honest about their intentions when they made the case for the concentration and centralization of power, both around a single party project and within it in the office and the person of the president. And that began a process of authoritarianism that spread across the continent. Authoritarianism, which was to become a defining feature of perhaps the first decade of African independence. Now, there's a lot which has been written about that period in Africa's contemporary history. A lot of it, I'll argue, tends to be tendentious insofar as it tends to stigmatize the African. When you pick up the average African studies literature, as a litany of adjectives that have been deployed, sometimes ex post facto, to try to explain and describe what Africa went through in the period, with the World Bank even convincing itself that that was a lost decade in Africa's experience. But the rebuttal against that has also been done convincingly in the literature for us not to waste too much time here. What is important, and which I want to point to, is the fact that even if it was impeccable in terms of the ideals and ideas that informed it, the authoritarianism which grew in the course of the 1960s into the 1970s was to undo itself from within, because it became increasingly dictatorial to a point where even the goals of unity and development that justified it in the first instance failed to be achieved. And this was to be seen across the continent. Typical statistics about the state of Africa indicated a failure not just to accelerate development, but even to catch up. And examples have been given of countries which were on the same broad levels of development at independence with Africa, which basically galloped away from the continent in terms of their development record. I probably don't need to cite the example of South Korea or Malaysia or Indonesia and many others. But perhaps even more painful is the fact that authoritarianism became a source of division, not so much a source of unity, because as power became concentrated and unaccountable, it also became nepotistic and narrow. to a point where armies were recruited by presidents solely from their ethnic groups, for example. And security services were dominated by particular groups and regions of countries, setting the stage for some of the contestations that snowballed into civil wars in the course of the 1990s. And this was the broad background against which the transitions of the 1990s began. Instability followed instability. West Africa was a gold medalist in that regard. Hardly a month would pass by without news of a coup or of an attempted coup. And in the cases of Nigeria and Ghana, we seemed to shadow each other very closely. If something happened in Accra, you could be sure that within a year, martial music would also be sounding somewhere in Nigeria, announcing the birth of a new council, whether of a supreme nature or of a redemptive nature. Matters were not helped in the 1970s by the onset of economic crisis. Failing to deliver development, African countries got themselves, for various reasons, immersed in huge indebtedness, which by the end of the 1970s became almost impossible for them to finance. And so waves of austerity measures were introduced. I think maybe there are people in this room who are too young to remember some of the tough conditions that prevailed in this country, but which was also replicated in the course of the 1980s across the rest of the continent, provoking anti-austerity riots in which yours truly also participated as a student in Nigeria, but which basically spoke to the dissolution of what one might call a post-colonial social bargain between state and society, in which, broadly in return for acquiescence within a framework of legitimate statehood, citizens found their conditions increasingly eroded, even as states became more authoritarian and repressive in nature. Austerity reinforced that logic of repression and of authoritarianism. And by the end of the 1970s into the mid-1980s, what were the initially tough austerity measures introduced by governments across the continent became full-blown structural adjustment programs, about which you have written in several of your publications, whether it be your codicial presidential address at the end of your tenure or the book which you produced on the politics of adjustment in sub-Saharan Africa, documenting some of the tough conditions which Africans had to endure under leadership that had not only in many respects betrayed the ideals of independence, but also added an unwanted bargain of authoritarianism and repression on it. And effectively, this was the backdrop against which many began to take to the streets of Cotonou and other major African cities, resulting in the fall of long-standing dictatorships. Matthew Kerekou was basically reduced to a house mouse at the end. From being a maximum leader, the people confiscated power and constituted a sovereign national conference in which he was nothing but a caretaker leader, whilst the entire nation debated what should be the basis and foundation for a new republic and a new constitution produced out of it. Some of the wiser dictators quickly took preemptive measures by announcing constitutional reforms to open up the political space and give the people democracy. Others who are more stubborn were either to lead their countries to war or eventually to be overthrown ignominiously as so-called IMF or anti-structural adjustment riots spread from cities as far-flung as Cairo to Khartoum. I remember the news of rioting Sudanese jubilating together with the security forces who had been sent to repress them as the army announced that Jafar al-Numeri had been overthrown and replaced by a new set of leaders. Now, if change was to come to the continent, if democratization was to be undertaken, how was this to be achieved? It seems to me that perhaps one of the big mistakes of the period was insufficient attention to the kinds of democratic politics which the context and the conditions of the times demanded, and that perhaps we were too hasty in putting a lot of emphasis on the rights that had been denied us under authoritarian and repressive leadership, military or single party, to a point where the completeness and comprehensiveness of what a democratic renewal could offer became more or less reduced to a minimalist menu of things that needed to be done. Constitutional amendments licensed a multi-party system to be reintroduced. Election management bodies were set up, and we invested considerable energy in trying to make sure that they were independent and had integrity. And across the continent, we are looking for more Afarijans who will help us to ensure that the elections are free and fair by all means possible. We were concerned about issues of civil liberties and of human rights. And I don't mean to diminish these, because if you haven't lived under authoritarianism, if you haven't suffered repression in the way in which those who, in some instances, championed the reform agenda had suffered, you probably will not value the fact that it does matter to have a right to demonstrate, to have a right to assemble, to have a right to a fair hearing under the rule of law, not to be beaten and tortured in prison simply for criticizing a president, or in the case of Yakubu Gowon in Nigeria, of a citizen who crossed him on the phone and who was told to drop the line, not knowing that it was a military president who was giving instruction, only to be traced and arrested and beaten for crossing the president on a line. Now, of course, he wasn't the manager of the National Telecoms Company, and the manager himself did not suffer any reprisals, but disobedience was not to be broached. And there are many examples which can be given of the kinds of pain which people experience simply for holding a contrary, an alternative, or a dissenting view. And so, no, I do not wish to diminish, but retrospectively, I think it's important for us in thinking of how we go ahead to the next phase of democratization on our continent, to also reflect on what could have been beyond what was in the course of the transition of the 1990s that we saw across the continent. To be sure, that transitional process, even as it began to consolidate itself, produced a number of excitements across the continent. Excitement, for example, at the fact that incumbents who had held power were defeated in elections, and that they accepted their defeat, right? That telephone call to congratulate the winner and to say, I concede, and the whole country would heave a sigh of relief that finally we are rid of a dictator. Or of the alternation of power, which was pioneered even in Ghana, where an incumbent from a ruling party would lose to an opposition candidate. And again, spectacularly in Ghana, sometimes were very narrow margins, which in my own country would have been completely unimaginable. That a concession would be given immediately on the basis of a few thousand votes that made a difference between the two grand political traditions that have underwritten the Ghanaian political system for years. Of the fact that within the context of the new dispensation, term limitation was introduced. And so the idea, which we had suffered in previous decades, of life presidencies, of people declaring themselves messiahs ad infinitum, would be something that would be a story of the past in our experience. Of the decision by the African Union and of ECOWAS under the leadership of Dr. Chambers to insist that if power would change hands in any country on the continent, it would only have to be by means of elections, representing the sovereign will of the people of the continent, and that nobody would be welcome either to the councils of ECOWAS or of the African Union who comes to power by means other than democratic elections conducted. I can cite many examples of those gains, and I think you understand where I am headed. But there have also been concerns within the parameters of what we have celebrated as successes of our democratic journey so far. And amongst them are issues that continue to worry Dr. Chambers and his colleagues of electoral integrity. And many countries where pleas have to be made behind the scenes and sometimes open threats that don't stuff the ballot and don't try to change the results last minute when you get intelligence agencies telling you that, Mr. President, it looks like you are losing, and you tell them, suspend the counting. And Ibn Chambers and his colleagues would fly in quietly, gather a few notables, and encourage the president to accept his fate and concede. So we still have issues of electoral integrity that we deal with. And this has been documented in the literature of a resurgent presidentialism, because presidential power haven't been tamed in an earlier phase, but with presidents basically recouping power on a massive scale in so many countries, of changes which we see taking place in the balance between the three arms of government, in which early signs of judicial independence or parliamentary autonomy are being lost in too many countries. And again, I can cite many examples of the problems and difficulties which we confront. And this is where I think that the challenge of building on the gains made and extending the experience of democratization in order to avoid a danger either of wholesale reversal or of a politics of anti-politics that could be detrimental to peace and stability in too many of our countries needs to be taken seriously. In this connection, it seems to me that one of the biggest omissions was the failure to make a strong connection from the outset between the political reforms which were driven and the socio-economic reforms that were necessary. That failure to make a connection between political reforms and socio-economic change has, in my view, perhaps been the single biggest obstacle to far-reaching and deep-seated democratization on the continent. And they are the kinds of things which you have written about, because when we come to think about it, at the heart of the bargain between state and society is not simply a question of rights and liberties, but also within it of social and economic livelihood. And on this score, in the course of the 1980s into the 1990s and to date, African countries have almost without exception surrendered social and economic policy making to international financial institutions. In the 1980s and 90s, this was mainly captured under the label of the structural adjustment programs, for which many of us in this room fought battles of an ideological and political nature to suggest that the adjustment programs that were proposed were little more than a sentence to perpetual pain and underdevelopment. Because as an economist once put it, of a heterodox persuasion, the biggest mistake of orthodox economics, of neoliberal economics, is basically to say that a patient who is ill with a particular disease, let's say it's malaria, can only be cured by being given more malaria, essentially. And once you have a situation in which economies are in severe distress and crisis, what needs to be done in a lot of cases is simply to find the mix of policy instruments that will enable you to get the economies back on track. Even if austerity is imposed, it is understood in most development economics that this would simply be a temporary diversion from development, not the permanent new norm for seeking to achieve development. And so it's not surprising at all that, contrary to the claim that it is actually the first decade of independence that was lost in Africa, it is actually the decades that followed from the 1990s onwards that have been lost on our continent. And in the context of the effort to build democracy, this particular question of sovereignty over economic and social policy was not put at the center of the democratic project. Effectively, therefore, our democratic experience, in spite of all the motion, in spite of all the pomp and circumstance that has gone with it, and in spite of some of the gains which we have made, I think actually we should congratulate ourselves that in an impossible situation, we made something out of it, has reached its limit. Because in the face of this unchanging and unyielding socioeconomic framework within which policy is undertaken, increasingly, democracy, as practiced, is nothing other than a tool for the legitimation of a neoliberal agenda, of an agenda which, in the context of the continent today, speaks not only to a persistent poverty, but also of high and unsustainable levels of unemployment among our young people, and above all, of growing inequality on a scale which we have never seen before. Not because that inequality is the product of an accident, but because it is actually a deliberate design integral to the entire neoliberal agenda. And in a context in which inequality becomes the defining feature of a society, democracy actually becomes itself a formalistic ritual. So should any of us be surprised that increasingly in many countries, citizens find it impossible to make a link between what is celebrated as democratic gains and successes and their lived daily conditions? To a point where cynics would even ask, are we going to eat democracy? In Ethiopia, where I live today, people would look at me, drivers, taxi drivers, my own office colleagues, and say, actually, during the time of Mengistu Haile Mariam, he controlled the price of beer, of teff. Teff was cheap. And now we have this guy who is just, everything is just up. Everyday prices are changing in the supermarkets. And it's that inability to make a link between the capacity which is inherent in democracy to deliver development, and of development to be a tool for democratization, of the symbiosis that ought to connect them, that our challenge lies today. And perhaps these are not terribly new things to us, but if on election day we have seen it, it's not an invention. It's probably not as dramatic in Ghana, but look across and look at what was being distributed at the last elections in Nigeria. And people would make a packet of kuli and put the face of a candidate and go to the electorate and distribute to people. It's not a joke. And distribute to people to vote for their preferred candidate. Right? Basically buying the sovereign will of the people with pittance, because the people have been so driven into misery and poverty to a point where election day is their best opportunity to get a bit out of the system. It is rational, it is logical, but it is anti-democratic. And you don't see them anymore until 4 years on, when they have to come to campaign again and bring you a 5-kilo customized bag of rice with their faces on it. And to be sure that you don't cheat them, you also take your mobile phone to take a photo of where you thumb printed in order to then collect some cooking oil to go with your rice. We have seen it. It is not just a story which is limited to one country. It is a story which is replicated to one degree or the other across our continent. And Lisa Laxo, as far back as the 1990s, called it voting without choosing. Thandika Nkamdawire in the 1990s was to develop this further, building on Claude Ake, who warned presciently when this transition started that the parameters of democratization that we were embarking upon was actually the beginning of a democratization of disempowerment. And precisely on this point, Nkandawire was also to warn that democracies normally ought to be about negotiation and bargaining. But in the African experience, social and economic policy have been excluded from any serious public conversation and debate because a donor regime of truth has prevailed around the world, anchored on a neoliberal hegemony, which suggests that these issues are not for conversation. Elected officials may no longer talk about structural adjustment, but they have the medium-term expenditure framework that they must agree with the international financial institutions, and where, regardless of who we vote into power, whether from the left or from the right, from the north or the south, east or west, within a year of getting into office, reality strikes. You can't do much about your economic or social policy. And that is what he described as the bane of Africa's choiceless democracies. Democracy which ordinarily ought to give choice, an alternative, and allow for compromises and bargaining to take place around the broad direction of society for the sake of sustainability and stability, is reduced essentially to an exercise in periodic rituals which are not even properly conducted in too many places. And this is where I think, again, drawing on your own experience, Professor Sawyer, this is where I think the time has arrived, where in rethinking where we go and how we break what seems to be a stalemate in our experience of democratization, we also have to begin to address our minds to the ways in which we can reinvent active citizenship. Because too many of our citizens have also somehow given up. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. You can celebrate and dance for all you wish, for a night, lose your voice, a few even lose their lives, jubilating that candidate X has won, and our hope has been kindled that there will be change. 2 years after, listen to the metaphors which citizens use, and you begin to understand that they have already discounted the 4 years of that regime and come to the conclusion that this one is either Baba go slow or this one is Baba no show. And we wait for the next cycle. And that cycle breeds a cynicism, which, if it was not expensive to the stability and well-being of our countries, may have been dismissed lightly. But those who give up hope, what do? Political sociologists have been debating in the last few years. We go into religion, a new religiosity that has spread across Africa, to a point where even on election day we wait for TB Joshua to tell us who might likely win. Not because we do not know what our conditions are, but because that new religiosity has replaced any hope or any idea of a vision of transformation of society that we may harbor. A surrender of citizenship going side by side with the erosion of citizenship by poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Or of the hordes of young people who make the migratory journeys across the Sahara and perish in the Mediterranean. A lot of them trekking, a lot of them being cynically trafficked, and some of them being sold into slavery. Or of those who choose to sell their organs. I have 2 kidneys, take one and give it to whoever and give me some money in order to be able to pay a fee, because education is no longer free, even at the primary level, even if it is nominally proclaimed to be free. And one can cite again examples of, in this many examples of this kind. Unless active citizenship is rekindled and revived, such that citizens begin to understand that interim solutions that includes going to join Boko Haram or seeking to migrate or setting up a new industry in kidnapping, regardless of whoever is kidnapped, there is a price for everybody, appropriately calibrated according to the contacts you have in your mobile phone. Unless people understand that there is actually no long-term sustainable answer and that destiny lies with us, in our hands, and that we as citizens represent the highest office in the land, not the person we elected president, not the person we elected governor, but that we, the people, are the highest office of the land, we may not, in fact, be able to get out of this very quickly. And I think perhaps a glimpse of what that reclaiming of citizenship might be able to offer us is what we have seen happening in Algiers and what we have seen happening in the Sudan. Even in their incompleteness, even in their reversibility, we have seen that the will and the power of the people to take their destinies into their hands is the only sure banker that a renewal and a reconstruction can take place. And from that point of view, I think as we celebrate your 80th birthday, we can probably have some hope that that reclaiming of active citizenship can take place in your lifetime. We can. Thank you.
Well, the people have spoken. Distinguished guests, I think you will agree with me that we could not have had a better keynote speaker. To dissect for us the conditions that we know so well, but perhaps cannot express so succinctly and with all that English. Thank you very much, Bayo. And as we can see, he has spoken to key ideas and issues that have been the focus of Professor Sawyer's own life. Now we have a short film on Professor Akinlakpa Sawyer. So just to break before the discussants come in. So if you will indulge us for a little bit, we will show the film. So we have 2 discussants. Ms. Zenibewoke Tadesse, who is Principal Vice President, Ethiopian Academy of Sciences. Her biography is in the booklet. And to save time, I will not introduce her formally, but I will ask her to go up and make her remarks.
I would like to thank the organizers for this well-deserved celebration of a committed scholar, Pan-Africanist, and a true example of an active citizen and a public intellectual par excellence. I have had the privilege of knowing Professor Sawyer for almost 40 years. And it's only today that I begin to know his name. So I still have to discover a long history. I have benefited immensely from his various writings, which I will not summarize, as most of you seem to be aware of his vast knowledge, as was said in the last session, his wisdom. We haven't heard much about his sense of humor, but some of us at the time of crisis that Godwin mentioned look for his smiles, but that covers up a lot of wisdom and calmness, which usually solves a whole host of very hot issues. So I would like to hear about his sense of humor and how that has served other purposes and revealed his own knowledge. In Codesria, my experience with Professor Sawyer is that when we have a crisis, we always go look for him, whether it is a minor crisis or a major one facing the institution or personalities within our council. And his principal stand, his principal stand and his vast legal knowledge has always solved very critical issues. So when Godwin ensures the biography, I'm sure a lot of these things will be anchored in empirical reality. My last reading of his vast work was the speech that he gave when he left the presidency of this institution. And a lot of people have mentioned about his negotiation skills, his commitment to preserving the vast resources of Ghana, which continue to be exploited. And in the conclusion of his outgoing speech, he put out 3 points that directly link to what Professor Adebayo mentioned, addressed, and to the theme of the conference. One, he said, the problem with the exploitation of the mineral resources of Ghana was due to the lack of political competence by those who do the negotiations. Second, failure of institutional responsibility and oversight, which I think Professor Adebayo explained applying to the entire continent, our entire continent in terms of giving away of our natural resources. And finally, he said, the failure of civic vigilance and follow through. And he emphasized the parliamentary irresponsibility thrives on the atmosphere of civic inertia, calling our attention to the importance of civic participation. I will not summarize what has already been brilliantly put to us this afternoon, but I would like to link Professor Sawyer's work on structural adjustment, or more broadly on neoliberalism, and how, starting with the value of defending our tertiary institutions to the illicit transfer of our resources. But what I have learned from his writings and from the dire picture that Professor Olukushi pointed was our failure to build institutions. We have said that one of the qualities of Professor Sawyer, indeed, is building institutions. And I think at a state level, at a societal level, we haven't done very well in terms of building strong institutions that defend the interest of our continent. And I think that is one long-term impact of neoliberalism. And I don't think we have done sufficient work on this issue of the dire impact of structural adjustment on our long development trajectory. For example, one of the issues that Professor Olukushi mentioned were institutions like parliament, electoral commissions, and so forth that have come about since the beginning of multi-party elections. Now, these institutions are so fragile and can change at a whim, as was brilliantly explained by the keynote speaker, that it has become almost meaningless. Parliaments, for example, cannot make decisions on the key issues that are of major concerns to our continent, particularly those of social and economic policies. And so what is a parliament, for example, if it cannot decide on how a budget is to be allocated? But yet we celebrate parliament as one of the outcomes of a multi-party system. Other long-term impact of neoliberalism has also been our inability to sustain political reforms. Our political life revolves these days about elections per se, as was said by the speaker, as rituals, not really bringing alternance that is meaningful and anchored in our daily reality. So how are we to overcome these obstacles that, despite reference to post-Washington consensus, still remain part of our major realities that we have not been able to, as the speaker noted, to make sovereignty and economic and social policies. So a democracy not being able to do these things becomes terribly vacuous, and alternance becomes a ritual, as was said. I am particularly going to emphasize two forces that I think have been energized by multi-party landscapes in this continent, despite all the shortcomings that have been explained by our key speaker. And these are the youth, on the one hand, both students and unemployed youth, which are much broader, and in almost all of our countries, the majority of the society at this particular juncture of history, and women, who we mostly argue make up at least 50% of the population, but often more than 50% in a lot of African polities. Now, the young people, Professor Adebayo mentioned Sudan, for example, as the most recent example of the energy of democratic forces on our continent. And if you diagnose what has been happening in Sudan, clearly no one will contest the fact that it is young men and women, and Sudanese women, who actually anchored the very lengthy resistance. It's not quite clear they have made it to the new dispensation, but nonetheless, they did sustain the struggle over a long period of time. And we can say the same about Algeria, which is still going on, and other areas of struggle for democratization and active participation, or at least increased participation, which is something we cannot say about the earlier phases of post-independence struggles. So how do we then explain this increased participation, but the disillusionment that Professor Adebayo explained to us so clearly, or the disillusionment that comes from choiceless democracies? I think this is a major challenge that I hope institution builders like Professor Sawyer will continue to enlighten us with their continuous work, because there is a disjuncture between this increased enthusiasm and participation by young people and the outcome being extremely limited or thwarted toward other arenas. So I would like to mention one of the long-term impacts of neoliberalism and this domination that we have been subjected to, as was said, I'm not saying anything new, is that the changes that come about are so limited or so thwarted that that explains some of the quick disillusionment and the nostalgia for periods past. We're told these days that one of the big changes in terms of active participation, particularly by young people, is the emergence of digital media and the freedom that it has provided young people to mobilize, to communicate, and to organize. But of course, as has been the case with other changes, this resource of democratization has a double sword. It also can be a voice for very retrogressive forces that sort of take away from the democratic content of those possibilities that this medium is creating, as opposed to, say, the old medium. But here again, we see our lack of institutional building in terms of, for example, a lot of people in the media, in the old media or the new one, have fought for access to information or a law towards that. But in terms of real implementation of these laws, there are a lot of vacuums that we can cite in a number of our countries. In the meantime, those ruling parties that want to stay in power have found a way to block this new resource that the youth and other citizens have in terms of communicating, organizing, mobilizing each other by literally blocking digital media, sometimes for a very long time, like in Chad, I think it's about almost 16 months, or in my country, where our new prime minister, who is the darling of the West, told us the internet is not air or water. You could live without it whenever he decides to block it. So we have these new possibilities that are basically short-lived because the powers that be do not want a sustained resistance to whatever policies or programs that they might set out for us. And so what is fascinating about looking very closely at the democratization process since the multi-party emergence, the second independence, as some people call it, is this contradictory process, possibilities coming with tremendous challenges. Finally, as we have heard from Professor Sawyer's life, his mother lived 103 years and produced for us Professor Sawyer, as we have been told this afternoon. But the story of women who do produce Professor Sawyer types of resources to this continent are often undocumented, and we do not appreciate their level of participation or lack thereof. And often our male colleagues particularly do not even bother to find out why is it that their participation is not so clearly articulated or clearly visible. Going back to the issue of economic and social policy, we are often given the impression that economic and social policies are gender neutral. In fact, a growing volume of literature by women scholars and other concerned scholars has shown that this is far from the truth. The kind of immiserization that Professor Adebayo talked about is literally carried on the backs of women citizens. If there is austerity, it's women who have to make sure that the family survives one way or the other. And this livelihood requirement makes it difficult for women to be active participants of politics. But nonetheless, what we have seen in this continent in the last at least 30 years, if not longer, is that despite tremendous difficulties due to austerity, to cultures that subordinate women and generally patriarchy, women have become very active participants in the democratization process. But here again, I want to quickly underscore the fact that their participation has turned into the ritual that Professor Adebayo explained so brilliantly. That is to say that our demand for equal rights in a new democratic Africa has turned into simply numerical representation in parliaments that, as said earlier, are not even making the critical political or social policies. So that while the number of women parliamentarians and the number of women in the executive has increased, that has not meant the type of active citizenship that Professor Sawyer calls us to ensure, because they are in these institutions where they are not expected to make policy. Or if they make policy, it is not for the benefit of the majority of the population, least of all, the majority of women. So while the good governance agenda has indeed created entry points for addressing gender-based inequalities, it also has not made it possible for those women who are entering these arenas these public arenas to have the capacity and accountability to make policy in the first instance, and to also be accountable to women, because they often enter these arenas in the name of women, through quotas, through other means, and so forth. So what has happened is this whole admiration of how many women in the Ghanaian parliament. Ghana is always criticized for not having sufficient number of women in its parliament, but other countries are, get accolades for managing anywhere from 30 to 49%. But we have been unable to ask the question, what has this new entry into public institutions meant in terms of making real political and economic and social policies that would transform the lives of those that suffer from austerity and so forth. So what we have been subjected to is a reduction of our representation to simply numbers of women in these institutions that have been incapacitated by the neoliberal policies and our choiceless democracies. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that in talking about, in following the spirit of this conference and really defining increased civic participation, we also have to do a serious analysis of the ways in which these participations are limited and why they are limited. We shouldn't always externalize the limitations, but nonetheless, being subject to these major forces makes it necessary for us to really look internally as well and talk about what it is that we need to do, not only to activate civic participation, which I think across the continent we see particularly young people getting engaged in, but what is the post entry into these institutions and activism. I just want to conclude by saying that one thing that I learned from Professor Adebayo's paper and Professor Sawyer's general discussion on these issues is the anomaly about the African democracies. They have actually become much more vibrant at a time when there is backsliding of democratic realities globally. And we do, I agree with Professor Adebayo that it's not enough to celebrate simply active participation, but it still needs to be underscored that at a time when so-called Western and more entrenched democracies are backsliding, as we can see in the US and the United States, in Africa, we should be happy that citizen activism and democratization is still on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dese, for pushing us, bringing in issues particularly of women and representation, and reminding us that indeed, as I'm sure in the last few days we've all been watching the rumpus in the British Parliament and the cul-de-sacs, etc. So we do need to celebrate the resurgence of our democracies, but we need to do more than that. We need to push the envelope further and really look at what we can do to reinvent active citizenship. Dr. Akwete, please take the floor now.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Protocols observed. Yesterday, I had to ask Yao how many minutes I have to, because the program had no time slots. And he said, well, 15 minutes, but he could add one to make it 16. And he thought it was quite generous. So we've come to a point that I would like to stick to that before he draws my attention that my time is out. And I've learned a few things that excites me. I think, first of all, Prof.
The chair has overruled it. You have 12 minutes.
12. Oh, mine. Okay. He remembered that it's 12. I thought he wouldn't. Okay, I'll do it 12. But this initial GFA is good, and I think we would describe it in IDEG. Prof is our current chair of the IDEG Governing Council, but I also have Professor Florence Abnadol-Fine here, the immediate past, and it's good to acknowledge her, and then Mr. Atwampia, council members of IDEG. So let me go straight and say that it's an interesting and very insightful presentation. Bayo and I go a long way back. I do not want to tell you why he now likes these kinds of shirts. You should see his winter jackets, but now it's a different time. And most of what is said here are things I accept. We converge on a number of things. But in my 12 minutes, which is starting now, I thought I should make a number of critical points. Because the African scholarship is also defined by active citizenship, and not in terms of what we do or see on the road in Sudan or in Algeria, but also in coming to realization that the kind of democratization we've experienced, what is usually called the third wave, what started from 91, 92, and we have it now, probably has lived its day. It's come to an end. What it can do, its full potential has been realized. It is very difficult to do the alternation that we did in the past from early independence states to one-party states to the military, and then you go back to another multi-party regime that lasts about 27 months, and then we come again, the army comes, we have revolution, and we call them First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic, and we have Fourth Republic. In spite of the challenges we face today, nobody would accept that the army should come back, even if there is a desire. The frustration of many people is that this democracy is not working, and some change ought to be made. The question is it the alternation that will solve the problems we are confronting, or is it a different look at what it is that we can do? And I think to the extent that the AU, ECOWAS, has now protocols and charters that makes it difficult. If you look at Sudan, yes, the crowd came out, but you saw the Ethiopian Prime Minister there with an AU special envoy to negotiate the time of the exit or the settlement, probably the longest. So we've entered a phase of negotiating how changes will be made, and that is keeping many of the democratic systems stable. But what we haven't done, which is what Bayo calls the stalemate, and he says transformation. I've looked at the story of Ghana. We're in our Fourth Republic. We've had our first and celebrated. This is the first time that we have had 27 years of a multi-party democracy. And so it means a lot, but in that 27 years, probably we've learned more about political parties and governance than we ever did in our history, because they did not have enough time to stay in there, and we had very negative views about parties. They would divide us, they would steal our monies, and all those things are happening, but we still now feel that, we still feel that at this stage, we don't think getting them out the way we did in the past is the solution. So where is the solution? And that is where I think critical scholarship and active citizenship comes in. There are those who've said to us that, look, no African country that has done multi-party democracy since in the 90s till now has been able to increase economic growth and move towards transforming the economies within what is now considered to be the generational span of transformation. It's either 25 years to 30 years. So they'll tell you about South Korea, they'll tell you about Malaysia, in Asia, and China, 30 years. And so you ask yourself, how did they get there? And the answers we get has been that, oh, there are two countries that are outstanding. We have Rwanda, and we have Ethiopia. And then we are told that we need a developmental state. So it is also, in a way, telling us, move back to authoritarian statehood. But we know it's not working because Ethiopia now says it's going multi-party. So where is the solution that we're getting from the discourse about our development and developmental experiences in the Western media? It is no solution. So where lies the solution? And I think the more we think about this, I couldn't agree more with, or less with Bayo when he said we should, a strong case exists for a wholesale rethinking of what democratic governance and development should mean for Africa. I think that we've stuck to the central model, centralized power, state power. And democratization as transition from democracy has always looked at the center. The parliaments come, then we have other state institutions, the human rights commissions and others and so on. And we are always of the view that, yes, we need to strengthen the center so we could have a strong state that could lead or steer our economic transformation and hold us together as a nation and so on. But at this stage in time, we are 62 years. I hope I'm right, Prof. If I made a mistake, it's because of your initials, sorry. We have come very far to be, for us to be clear that the strong state we set out to create in this particular Fourth Republic has become a weak state. What explains why our institutions are collapsing, why we can't enforce the rule of law, why there is no equality before the law? And in democracy, equality before the law is one of the cardinal principles, and we can't enforce it. So there's a problem with this whole model. What I think we can do, and based on a lot of critical thinking involving Prof, and I don't want to tell you that on his 80th birthday, when we went to see him and wish him well, we had to spend about 1.5 hours doing a seminar on whether our critical thinking about how to change the system would work or not. We were saved by Auntie Judith, who kindly came in and said, "Why don't you take a photo together?" That picture. So this is our thinking. Our thinking is that where we are now, probably wholesale thinking is too large, but we probably must now look at active citizenship in terms of the crowd that comes out. Mostly they are moving authoritarian regimes that have been in power for over 20 years, to a stage where we ask ourselves, what kind of changes are required? And it will involve changes in terms of the structure of power and power relations in society. So if you take Ghana, for instance, we talk about the need for build on the foundations, what we've achieved in the last 27 years. Can we now look at the possibility of transitioning or having a second democratization, which is how to move power, devolve is the word, power, from the center to local. Because indeed, our local economies are underdeveloped, not even, we can't say they've stagnated, they are just bad. UNICEF 2015 report, it says Ghana is competing to be amongst the 10 most unequal countries in Africa. I don't know if we haven't already gone there and probably competing with the 5. It talks about the real poverty, and it's just impossible to see public service, government services being delivered. The state is probably dead. But yet, we still celebrate and say, well, decentralization. There's no decentralization. In fact, we've seen re-centralization of state power. We think that a second transition will require that we see democratization being internal, a lot of state power, resources at the center, or to go local. And how do we do that? And I think, for me, that second democratization probably will define Africa's contribution to democracy, which will be the 4th wave. It is something probably Huntington wouldn't have the opportunity to write about because it would be peculiarly African. Now, how do we develop that? I'll just give you 2 examples. Please, how much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay, all right. I think constitutions are important to democratization. And most of the constitution we've had across African countries have maintained the model of centralizing power, the so-called winner takes all, excluding people, not finding ways of building consensus, community, and to find the common basis on which we rise as one people, irrespective of the various identities. And so we need seriously to now, and we need the lawyers, the constitutional lawyers and others, to really begin to look at how do we devolve power such that exclusion, winner takes all, and the kind of development that is not really moving us forward can be dealt with. I think within the existing framework of our constitution, for instance, in Ghana, we can tackle that problem. For instance, we've been advocating for that article that anchors winner takes all and bans political parties from participation in local government. Should be changed, Article 55.3. And when we did further research, what we found is that, and you'll be astounded, since the last time we had multi-party elections in Ghana was 1958. In all the 4 republics that we've had, parties don't contest local elections. And yet, parties are the drivers of change if you want to see new constitutional arrangements because of their nature. Independent, they compete for power, they are recognized in constitutions, and when they are coming in, you have to create legal and institutional frameworks to enable them. So it also means that we have to question some of our prejudices. We've been very dismissive of political parties because we don't like how we've experienced them from early times to now. but we haven't asked ourselves, what do we substitute them with? The army didn't do it. The No Party didn't do it. So the question for that transition I'm advocating is, how do we make them serve us? How do we redesign them? What are the conditions we create? And as a people, we have the power to redefine their legal framework. We have the power to really put what we consider to be our core values and norms. And we always sacrifice this. We don't spend time on this. So critical activism going forward, I think for me, is that there is the time to now find critical thinkers who innovate. It's not just swinging, alternating, and copying from, because the West or the East do not have the solutions to the challenges we are facing now. This is the only continent where economic, social, political, and other developments have to take place, or progress have to be made concurrently. The sequence of first build the economy and steadily give democratic rights and start looking at social work, it's not there. We have to do everything at the same time because the demands, that's the nature of it. It is a challenge, and I hope that, the chair is looking at me. So this is all I have to say, but please think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akwete, for reinvigorating us and challenging us about active citizenship in an active democracy, as opposed to when it is against a repressive regime, and how to make the parties serve us, how to redefine things. You've heard a lot from this side of the room. It's now time to give the opportunity to hear some voices. Unfortunately, we have gone over our time, but it will really be against everything that Professor Sawyer believes in if we did not allow you to also have your say. So I invite you to be brief and to make some contributions. And I see that His Excellency Amos Sawyer would like to make some contributions. So if you can take the mic there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I could not have come to Ghana this time a better time. We came in for the Kofi Annan the forum, and just ended at about 3 o'clock. So thanks to our good friend here, the man who drives a lot of things, sometimes from behind the scene, even more so. He informed us, and we're very, very thrilled to be here. I would have wanted to be on this panel if I had known in advance, and I would have written some things to present. But I like to, if you give me just 1 minute, my namesake is someone I got to know back in the early 70s, not through the family connections that we are trying to now discover, and there is one, but through Professor Tipote, Dr. Tipote, his good friend, who is my friend also, and we work together. We both had come back from university, graduate studies, and were wrestling with social problems. How do we make a difference in the society and all of this? And so in Liberia, we began the movement for justice in Africa. Began to work with the peasants, work with the mine workers, students, doing a lot of activities, activating things and moving forward. And we came frequently to Accra. Aki was one of our gurus, because he would now find out what we were doing and say, but you have to put this in some kind of a framework, a context. And so he began us on a reading list of things to deepen our understandings of what we were doing. And so we went back and we were able to put some theory and some systems behind deepening the understandings of what we were doing. I discovered we were doing really great work, very important work. So we decided to do a sector-by-sector study of social relations, students, workers, and we were just about to get around to the military when the coup took place. So we never understood the forces we were going to be dealing with thereafter. Had we taken Aki's advice earlier, I think the history of the Liberian struggle might have been a bit different. It was just a bit too late, but we've learned and we've been able to pass this on to generations of students through our activities and to solidify the friendship with him, and not only with him, with a whole group of Ghanaian scholars, because there was Emmanuel Hansen, who we were interacting with, Akwesi, Buchwe, a whole range of scholars. And we had the better for it. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. What we heard here today is a struggle that we are dealing with right now in many parts of Africa, where we have reached the level of maybe almost perfecting the routines of electoral democracy. Electoral democracy, I like to call it. How do we link this up such that this notion of, even if it's majoritarian rule, that the majority of the people can reap the dividends of it? It's a puzzle that, is not adding up. And so thanks, Bayo, for the insights, and we'll follow your work, and maybe we'll get some examples from there as to how we move forward in different ways. Thank you all so much. Good to be here.
Thank you, President Sawyer, and I want to assure you that it will not be too late for you to make a contribution to the volume that will follow this conference. So we'll look forward to receiving. Yes, Patty.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to join in celebrating Aki's many achievements and honoring him. But I would just like to look forward, and I just want to raise a question. How are we going to revive a vibrant intellectual environment in this country? I remember the days of the Legon Observer, etc. But this is the question I want to pose. How are we going to really stimulate a vigorous intellectual tradition in this country? Because that could play a critical role in sustaining our democratic experiment. But happy birthday, Aki.
Ambassador Hayford, behind you.
Thank you very much. Well, I stand on behalf of the youth of this country to say happy birthday to you, Prof. Professor Dayo, thank you very much for the invitation. And I quote, you say, "We the people occupy the highest office of the land." Thank you very much. This is an invitation and also a provocation. Fortunately, I'm sitting by one of the key people that made me enter media, Professor Kwame Kari. So I am well grounded, knowing very well that as a former journalist, the freedom that I hold in this country, nobody can take it away from me. Proceeding, I also see Professor Kofi Annan, and he said something that I used in my A-level literature, Harvest of Our Dreams. I think that your "we the people occupy the highest office of the land" is possibly that kind of journey we are looking for, that dream that we want to harvest. But now on the first view, I see Nana Dr. SKB Asante. I have read practically almost everything, and the key thing that he did say about the Constitution, development, and law is written about regionalism in African country. Practically almost all the things we are talking about has been discussed. Question is this: right from independence, we've read Leopold Senghor to Amin Sissoco to the latest guy in Cameroon, what's his name? The Cameroonian scholar, Mbembe. Achille Mbembe. All these things have been categorized. Question is this: how do we, as a young African, walk from this room and then practicalize the core? We, the people, occupy the highest office of the land. That is the million-dollar question that we need to look at this one. And on that one, I would want to say, Prof, once again, lives of great men remind us that we can live our lives sublime, and departing, leave footprints on the sands of time. And
Thank
some
you.
of us are proud to
Thank you.
take this tower. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'm not going to wish Aki happy birthday. I'm waiting for his 90th. Because if the mother lived that long, I will expect that at 90th and beyond, he'll be as active. Atibire, you made a brilliant presentation, but there was a missing gap, which I thought I should raise here. The sorry state of the forces of progress all over the continent, and the inability of us to reorganize to provide leadership and hope to the teeming unemployed masses. In Ghana here, we did make an attempt in 2007. It fizzled out. The question I ask, what is it that this event can raise? How can we connect the little sparks that are happening all over? I recall in 1975, my first baptism or introduction was two individuals who are here that led me to protest against the visit of an American poet who was in support of the Vietnam War. I think they know themselves. From then on, I never turned back. It was a world of making the country ungovernable. As I speak, the mining communities in the Townsend area are in turmoil. And Aki, I'll be coming to talk to you. How can we make sure that the multinational corporations that are here are not going to reduce those communities that are already fragile into the sorry state that we see in Tarkwa and Obuasi? Thank you.
Happy birthday, Prof. I think there's a chasm between the middle class and the rest of the people in this country. I'm focusing on Ghana. The gentleman over there was saying that how can we revive intellectual thought and all that. I think we do a lot of that, especially among the middle class. But the middle class has sort of isolated itself, for me, from the rest of the community. So if we want active citizenship, you know, we are a people who have trained our children to be white people in a country, in a black country. We have children who are prouder to speak with accents and behave like white people, children who can't relate to the grassroots, and we're always talking, we're always having fora, we're always having committees upon committees, and nothing filters down to the people so that this active kind of citizenship can really start. You know, I'm an Achimotan. There was a time when we were having Achimota Speaks here. We had it a few times, and then nothing else happened. And I was like, call me when Achimota begins to act, because I'm tired of Achimotans speaking and nothing else happening, you know? So I loved that lecture, Prof. Adebayo. But we need to go back and marry the people. It's time for the middle class to stop isolating itself and thinking that we are Europeans in Ghana. We need to go back because, you know, it's the communities that actually act. We talk and we do nothing, you know? But let us go, because they have something that we don't have. They are brave, they understand the issues, and as soon as they get it, they move, which we don't have. So please, this is my contribution. Thank you.
Very much. The last contribution here.
Thank you very much. Happy birthday, Prof. We talked about the youth and we talked about women, and very well spoken, Professor Adebayo. But first of all, let's talk about the youth here. It's Prof's 80th birthday, and from all the things they've said about him, he probably started speaking up and acting, probably what, age 30, 28, 25? How many of us in here are below 40, or 40 and below, or even 50 and below. I'm 50. The youth are not interested in the slow nature of things, or even the slow rise through the ranks to do the work. They want it fast, they want money, and they want it almost in an unethical manner. So yes, we want to take power, but we want to take power because we want to ride in a 4x4. Or we want to take power, we want to be in power because it's prestigious. And I think that it is so because there aren't enough people with the ethics. Prof talked about the new religiosity, and I say it's new religiosity devoid of ethics, values, and principles. We have all these people screaming the name of God, but it's all very superficial, and it doesn't go down into the work we are doing. And maybe all those things will have to change. People say, and yes, everybody knows I ran as vice presidential candidate. And then people said, well, but you're too clean. Politics, it doesn't have to be dirty. And these are all the things we have to address, because we are talking about people changing the face of things, but everybody is just looking at, what do I get? And until we clean that up, we're not going anywhere. And the youth are not changing. This is what they know, and this is what they're going to practice.
I just failed to wish Professor Sawyer to live beyond his mother's age.
And in so doing, live to see a full revival of active citizenship for transformation. That will fulfill a lifetime. No, I think the various observations which have been made are useful as further reflection. And I would say that, take the example of Moja. Even in my remote corner of northern Nigeria, we had a Moja visitor, Senator Wese, today a senator, who came to our university to talk about Moja, and we created a branch of Moja. Even if we didn't have too much of a chance against a military machine, we still felt that that kind of organized work was an important way of consolidating on some of the student activism that we had built around various causes. And so my answer, in part to a lot of the issues that have been raised, will be to say, begin with yourself and think of how you can organize. Because it is individuals who feel outraged or feel sufficiently motivated who begin a process and link up with like-minded people to constitute eventually a community and a movement that mushrooms into the kind of transformative power that we seek to see. I think we've been through a phase in which both technical and technocratic solutions have been proposed to us as a replacement for politics and political mobilization. It's running its course. I think the donors are also tired, and we also have been frustrated. We've been through a phase in which we somehow believe that the responsibility lies with somebody else. But the rubbish heap has actually come as a consequence right into our living rooms. In a place like Nigeria, you can build your fence as high as you like, put as much of razor wires as you like on those fences that people can't even see your house. But you step out today, the risk of being kidnapped is there on the basis of local intelligence by kidnappers on who is who on that street. And then, a bargaining starts on how much you should pay for ransom. And, talk of Somalia. Kidnapping has been going on for a long time. And talk of Darfur, talk of other places. So I think it's that challenge of self-questioning. All kinds of short-term solutions that have been tried by the middle classes If you are not going to be able to migrate to the US and Trump is saying you are not welcome anymore anyway, stay home or go back, then you must find a solution here. And I think minds will be concentrated increasingly to say that we have no option than to build better societies. And happily, I think Zen mentioned it, we're also in a period in which we see a certain lostness by so-called mature democracies, simply unable to figure it out. You know, people who told us that it's strong institutions they find themselves unable to deal with Trump. They don't know what to do with him, in spite of all the strong institutions. And we see the so-called mother of parliament being prorogued and suspended, just like that, by an unelected prime minister. And I'm thinking seriously that I might have to relocate my office to London to teach democracy.
Thank you for ending on that provocation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you all agree that we've had a stimulating evening. We could stay here for a very long time, but we also respect your time, and we know that tomorrow this conference will continue, and we want you to come back for more, those of you who can, who are not flying out on your busy lives. But we are happy that you've been able to join us in celebrating our own Prof. Aki Sawyer. And I think that the testaments that have been made about him, his convictions, his open-mindedness, his love for debate, but his fairness and respect, humility, simplicity, the adjectives could go on and on. And we have also been reminded that one of the perils of a long life is that you get to write about it. So we are waiting for the memoir. And it will be a no-holds-barred memoir. I couldn't begin to summarize our keynote address, but as I said, Professor Olukoshi has given us a very succinct history lesson, however old you are, taking us through our different phases and brought us right back to where we are. And the remarkable thing is that the issues that confront us are so similar. Over the past few days, we have seen the xenophobic attacks in South Africa on other African citizens. Completely unacceptable. The High Commissioner of South Africa to Ghana has made some very unhelpful comments. But at the same time, she strikes at some of the issues that have been discussed here. The poverty, the disillusionment, the fact that elections are useful, they are necessary, but they don't solve all our problems. And that we have not tackled the existential issues. Our speakers have characterized it as surrender over our social and economic policies. And this is something that is not going away, that we need to really deal with. And there is, some of the questions have brought up the issue of organization. How do we begin to organize against these mighty political parties with all their money? How do we find alternatives to this situation that we are in? And it has been suggested that we start with ourselves. That it is so easy to point the finger at the next person, but we start with ourselves. We question many of the things. We all vote, so we subscribe to something or other, but that should not blind us to the realities that we are living in. And that this issue of active citizenship, which is sometimes dangled before us, you know, it's like just be an active citizen. We really don't know what it means, but being an active citizen is going to lead to a lot of questioning of our modes of operating, of our institutions, the business as usual, to begin to address the chasms between the middle class and the rest of the society, the deepening inequalities that we are seeing, the political violence, and we will be dealing with some of those socioeconomic issues that have been hinted at today, but have not really been addressed. And the icing on the cake is that tomorrow we get to hear some remarks from the celebrant. So this should be enticing and should bring us all here if we can. And I look forward to seeing all of you. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for your solidarity. And see you tomorrow. And thank you to our panel.